The Green Mountain Club, one of our 30 trail clubs, just like the Appalachian Mountain Club in the Whites, is the predominant maintainer of the Appalachian Trail in Vermont. It's part of the Long Trail. The Long Trail runs the length of the state of Vermont from the Massachusetts line to Canada. So there's a whole series of overnight sites also. About 100 miles of the AT coincides with the Long Trail in Vermont, and there's a number of moldering toilets on that section, and also on the northern section, which is not part of the Appalachian Trail. Here's a nice slide of a fairly simple system. This is one of the earlier ones that was put in, a 2-crib system, and I'll explain more what that means in a minute here. So similar to what we discussed about batch bin, there's a little bit of history associated with this. It was actually a volunteer at the Green Mountain Club who had essentially a takeoff of a clivus in his home and said, well, I wonder if we could do something similar in the backcountry. One of the ways that moldering differs from batch bin is the temperature range is lower and it's a slower process. Remember those variables on batch bin, the key things you need. Here, you're taking the greatest advantage of time. In the batch bin, you're moving things forward because you've accelerated, well, you've increased heat and you've increased oxygen. Here, those two parameters are going to be less, so you take more advantage of time. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's not hot enough to kill disease-causing pathogens in a short amount of time, like the batch bin. Okay, we mentioned low to medium. So defined as a site will take a minimum of 2+ years for one crib to fill up. And we're hesitant to put numbers, but if batch bin comes in at 500 to maybe 4,000, we would see moldering from 200 or 300 visitors to maybe up to about 700 or 800. You could certainly do more, but it means you're going to have more cribs. It depends how much infrastructure you want to have. We try and limit from an aesthetic standpoint to 2 cribs. There are a few sites that have 3s. So this was an early prototype with the 6x6 construction, and we're going to look at some modifications or improvements that have come since. This one is actually made of hemlock. All this material could be packed in. Remembering we can't use pack stock on either the Appalachian or the Long Trail, so either airlift or human carry. Series of volunteers got together. This one was all essentially spiked together with a length of rebar coming down through the layers. Braced up. And then the tradition of getting a bunch of people together to move the outhouse. This outhouse was formerly over a pit toilet, so the pit toilet was closed for the last time and the crib installed, but the same outhouse was used. You just design the crib to fit what you already have for infrastructure. Because it's going to have to be removed at some point when that crib fills up, there's a number of ways you can do it, but this is a simple way of just attaching the outhouse to the top of that crib with angle brackets. There are a couple sites that we have made accessible, not this one, but we had to install a ramp, and that can be designed at the outset. Here's some basic design principles. We mentioned the dimension. The shallow depression, so you just make a little concave depression in the soil layer to catch the initial fecal material. And it's key that you don't create a solid box, solid siding, because you need airflow to go through there. And then we line it with hardware cloth and insect screening. So one of the key things is to make it solid enough to take the weight of the outhouse, but also not so burdensome that you can't move it periodically. So this is more like the systems that we've installed over in the White Mountains, and we make one crib that has 2 chambers. That other system, the advantage to a single crib is if you didn't have the space adjacent to move it over, once that crib is full, you can cap it, put a plywood cover on it or something. And then if the other crib has to be 200 feet away, you can do that. This system, they're going to be adjacent, and you'll see how that unfolds here. So everything's pre-built back here in the front country, all parts are labeled, and it's disassembled and brought in. We found with the exterior hardware cloth and the insect screening to actually mount vertical slats. So do a series of slats like this, which keeps curious hikers and the bigger critters from getting at it. You're really just trying to keep rodents and insects out, and it provides a little more support to the structure also, and gives it a little more of a aesthetic appearance. Maybe like 1 by 6, 2-inch gap between them, or 1.5 inches between them. So this is a 2 crib with a divider in the middle, more bracing. Okay, it's just volunteers putting one together. We'll get through these here. Pre-cut stair system. Okay, so basically the chamber there on your left is going to fill up first, and that's a function of visitation. That could be several years, it could be 1 season, depending how many people use a location. But once it's full, then the cover on the right, the outhouse is removed, the cover on the right is put on the crib on the left, and the outhouse is put on the right. You just swap them out. And in a well-designed system, in other words, the cribs match the amount of use, by the time the right-hand chamber has filled, the left one has composted, so you just keep alternating over time. Before I go into the moderated systems, similar to the end product that comes out of the batch bin, because we've taken advantage of potentially several seasons, that material is also dispersed on site and has a similar appearance to that inoffensive earth-like substance that we created with the batch bin. Now, we're going to look at 2 systems variations of the moldering system that a couple of entrepreneurs have created due to their local conditions. And I believe there's another presentation on moldering toilets here this afternoon. It's important to realize that molderings are still, they're past their infancy, maybe even their adolescence, but they're not necessarily into their adult years yet. We're still experimenting a little bit, making some adjustments here and there depending on local conditions, and gathering data from other composters about what they've done with their system. So this one's along the AT in Massachusetts, and crib shower requires regular tending to prevent overflow, and liquid separator requires a separate seat and drains to a modified French drain. So let's see what that looks like. Part of the reason they did this here was they were trying to process, this is almost like a hybrid between batch bin and a moldering toilet, because they are doing some actual mixing and letting it compost on its own as well. They do have a separate drain for urinal, a separate treatment system for liquid through a urinal. Knocking down the cone, it's not a term I've heard here today, but you'll all probably know what that means. You get the stalagmite in the center of the pile because all the deposits land in the same spot, and that tends to give a false indication of how full the pile is. You often hear from visitors, oh, the outhouse at Goose Pond's full, It's because they look down the hopper and they only see that stalagmite. So you need to disperse that out and make sure the pile is more uniform. So here they're using on-site forest material to add as a bulking agent. And they're doing a short amount of time in this, but oxygenating also. So as I mentioned, it's sort of a hybrid between the two. And this is what's being dispersed. They've also experimented with this. I'm just a little skeptical, but they're trying out the idea of liquid on one side and poop on the other. Some managers have done that with urinals. Of course, urinals, of course, effective for males. For females, we know from visitor behavior that a fair amount of the liquid that goes into an outhouse are from females, and that's just due to anatomy. If I were going to design this, I would make sure that that pot on the left there were deeper, for one, because of splashing. And I did ask Pete directly. I'm like, do you get feces on the other side? And he said, people have caught on, so they're not seeing too much of that. Anyway, deeper would be better. This is what's actually coming out the liquid end, and they've made a sand, sort of a French drain with gravelly or sandy soil. And again, it's only that, say, pint at a time. So here's one where the fourth bullet, someone asked about regulation, and this is along on the AT in Massachusetts, where the state agency wouldn't allow feces to contact soil and all. So they kind of borrowed from Clivus and built this chute that the waste is collected in. There's a better shot of what the inside of it looks like here. So this is where they're actually doing the moldering, is inside a contained unit, so it doesn't have the same aeration and all like the other system does. And here they took advantage of the grade of the slope. So here's where Pete's expertise comes in a little bit, his lessons learned. And the same thing we have at the moldering systems we manage. You can't rely on just the local carbon source, because people are only going to go so far to gather it. So you get this sort of denuded area around the outhouse, and in the Northeast, everything's pretty wet anyway, so we found we have to bring in an outside source. Most success with dry softwood planer shavings. They tend to be the most absorbent, so you can get those from a mill as well. And putting a base is really key underneath before the material starts to add. This is going to add that aeration and percolation of liquids right at the bottom of the pile. And make sure when you build those cribs that you have a side or rear access that you can periodically open up and get at the pile rather than just coming down through the seat. You can't do effects of cone knocking over or mixing just through the hopper of the toilet. And this is the last ones where you get into some tricky management questions, because moldering can dry out in a lower use. A moldering system can dry out in a lower use situation, whereas in batch bin, we have sort of the opposite problem, too much moisture. So we suggest, my personal recommendation is that the manager monitors the liquid and not have visitors urinate in a moldering. We've got this conflict sort of going in AT where some managers are telling visitors not to pee in a moldering, but not in a batch bin system. And the visitor just wants to get in, do the thing, and get out. They don't really know the difference between moldering and batch bin. They don't really care. So for us, the recommendation is to not pee in any composter, because we can put liquid in easier than we can take liquid out. So here's another little variation on that. On the covered side of the crib, they've actually put a few holes in it so that some rainwater can go in to keep the pile moist enough. And here out west, you may have to consider that. The pile just may get too dry. And if it's a remote area and personnel are not there that often, then you may need to figure out a way to get rainwater in there, even though it doesn't hardly ever rain here. And the sloping metal roof to the composting chamber prevent excessive moisture and reduce the chance of cave-in from heavy snow load. So that's just a design consideration. Okay, so similar, the Backcountry Sanitation Manual has a section on moldering, and Pete, I can get you all Pete's information for contact if you want to get with him directly about it. I'll tell you a little more about the sanitation manual here in the closing minutes. You'll see it was 2001, and the Appalachian Trail Conservancy will be revising the Backcountry Sanitation Manual next year, 2011, at the 10-year anniversary. And we've secured some funding for that project, but we're interested in having other contributors, either as authors or submitting design plans or helping out with the financing, either through time or actual dollars. So if you want to talk with me some more about that over the weekend, I can give you some more details. But currently, as far as we know, it may be the one document that has the sort of overview of the various systems out there. And we wanted to come out here to this conference because we view this weekend as a catalyst to the revision of the next edition, because there's so much great information here from all over the world and the various systems that are out there.
What are you doing? I mean, how are you doing as far as trash in these toilets? I mean, even just down to feminine products. I mean, are you guys packing it out, or how are you getting rid of it?
Yeah. I've been on all sides of this issue, including as a Leave No Trace Master Educator course instructor. So human waste and trash are something I've dealt with quite a bit. And I view much of our progress along a spectrum. So when you first put a system like this in, you're going to see visitor behavior similar to how it was when it was a pit toilet, even though you have good signage and everything else. And then through improved signage, talking to people about it when you can, literature, getting the message out about what should go in a composter and what shouldn't, you start to see a decrease in that material. So one of the things we provide is a blue Ziploc bag for feminine hygiene products. They're available from Associated Bag. It's an internet company. If you haven't found these things, it's just it's basically the same as a zippered bag, but they make a bunch of different colors. So we get blue to tie in with the blue bag initiatives around the country. And that has gone a long way towards compliance. Like we could say you need to pack out your feminine hygiene products and not throw them down the toilet. But unless you kind of have to meet the visitor halfway. Unless you give them something to work with, they're not likely to put it in a clear bag and have to look at it on a 3-day backpacking trip. But if you put it in a blue bag, it's just a little bit of a barrier. It's a psychological thing, but they're more willing to do it. So that's one thing we've done. The stuff that does end up in there, you run right through the system. So like in the batch bin, candy bar wrappers, feminine hygiene products, we create a list of most unusual items found in outhouses, I got a bunch of them. Bikini, anyway, dollar bills, all kinds of stuff. MSR pots, a mini mag still lit, watches that still work. Anyway, all that stuff. It goes through the bins and then onto the drying screens. So the operator doesn't take it out at the front end when it's still fresh. You basically compost it through and then pick it out off the screens when it's more inert. And it has to be packed out. And that's one of the hooks with the visitors. Say, again, it doesn't go away. Our maintainers have to deal with it.
My question is about you're talking about with the batch bin system, there's a sort of a leaching process. Is that what I understand? Do you have set parameters for how far you need to be from water sources, or is it just kind of a common sense approach, or just based on?
Yeah,
how do you make that?
We follow the same guidelines through either regulations or Leave No Trace guidelines of 200 feet. So most of the systems, the outhouses, are designed to be at least that far away from water along the Appalachian Trail. So the leaching system for the urine, the barrels, we run them back. If you can bury the pipe, that's even better. But they're usually hidden in trees within 30 to 40 feet of the outhouse, maybe even only 25 if you can disguise them. So they're still well away, in most cases, from the water source, or even wet areas, if there's a seep we're concerned about. So when you cross that line and say, too close, then we have the containment system so that we can collect the liquid and then take it away.
Do you have any opinions about the use of peat moss as a bulking agent?
Yeah, a little bit. We haven't done a lot with it. Some of the other clubs along the AT have. In situations where you have relatively low use, where you don't need that absorption and that bulking, like bark or planer chips will provide, because of the nutrients that are in peat moss, you do get fairly rapid colonization of the pile. You're just transferring from one medium to another. So that's a big positive there. It tends to be fairly moist and not as absorbent. But if that's what you have, and you can manipulate some of the other parameters to make it more favorable, it could work for you. So the question is about the sourcing of peat moss, and maybe from an environmental standpoint, is that appropriate, where we're using products that are essentially either waste or byproduct of another operation. Yeah, and as I was thinking, as we often get asked about the batch bin or molderings, and we get calls from all over the country about it. And that system has adapted to Northeast because of all those restrictions I showed at the beginning, plus the availability of the bulking agent. If you start looking at other places, you might say, well, what do we have that's either not going to be environmentally irresponsible or is just not available? And hardwood bark is not the only bulking agent you can use. It just happens to be one of the most favorable. There are others.
One more question there. I've been looking into composting toilets for the past year, doing some literature review, both of composting from the municipal solid waste and sewage sludge standpoint to try and get some background, because there doesn't seem to be a ton of publications, especially peer-reviewed publications on composting toilets. And wondering if you guys have addressed the stability and maturity of the compost, because it seems like temperature directly relates to pathogen destruction, but that there could be some restricting parameter characteristic, perhaps moisture or some other component that will block the maturity and stability of the compost, which can lead to phytotoxicity sort of in the environment.
Correct. So it's those three main components that you hit on are key, and they're all going to move around. It's how dry the pile is, how hot it gets, and time. Okay? So if you're weak on one, try and enhance the others. So our systems have sort of evolved where all three of those are more or less in stride. But if we had a case where we had to move things along quicker, or it just wasn't drying out, then we would take more advantage of the time piece, or we would add more bulking agent for absorption. And you get to where you can read the piles and know what it needs.
And what does that take? Training the operators or a certain amount of experience to get to that point?
It's both. Yeah, it's just like anything else. It's like when you first learn to do something, you're reading the literature and figuring out exactly how to do it. And the more and more you do it, you just develop an eye and a nose for it and know when it's good and when it isn't, and you validate that by testing.
Is there a way to use forest management practices in such a way that you could obtain your bulking material at the sites or very near to them?
Yeah.
So you wouldn't have to be bringing stuff in?
Yeah, we've given a considerable amount of thought to that, and where these locations are primarily high elevation for the Northeast, but you're getting into spruce fir and in some places above tree line. And it's all softwood. It's balsam fir, red spruce, some black spruce. So there are applications, if you could get lower elevation where you had more of a mixed forest and relatively low use, you possibly could create enough material through dead and down trees that you debarked on site or took wood chips or something like that. But for our volume, we'd have to extract too much from the immediate resource. Okay. We try to get, all that bark comes regionally, in some cases right off the same national forest, just down at lower elevation. And that's our weak link. I wish it was a completely closed system, that we didn't bring something in from the outside. So we do the best we can in that we're bringing in local material where we don't have the invasive concern. It's another consideration nowadays, if it was coming from far away. So right now, that's the best we've done with it. It's a good question, though. If you have an application where you could do that, that would be ideal. then there'd be nothing coming from the inside and nothing leaving.